kids are not commodities to be bought and sold. People are not property. Children have rights. The reason this issue has come up recently is that same-sex couples have begun to purchase children through surrogacy and in vitro fertilization. Liberals celebrate this novelty. Most conservatives find it instinctively abhorrent. But even some self-styled conservatives celebrate it. The reason for this unusual degree of confusion and controversy is that the issue is entirely new. Nothing like this has ever happened before in human history. The reason for that is twofold. First, our political order has, for the first time in the history of civilization, denied the necessity of sexual difference to marriage. That is, our system of law has, for the first time ever, denied the difference between men and women. The second reason is technological. For the first time in the history of the world, we can create and gestate human life outside of the conjugal act. For the first time ever, we can make babies without sex. Unfortunately, technology and ideology have outpaced bioethical inquiry. To quote Jeff Goldblum's character in Jurassic Park, "Your scientists were so occupied with whether or not they could that they didn't stop to think whether they should." Actually, the full quote is even more apt than that. In that full quote, Goldblum's character says, quote, "The lack of humility before nature that's being displayed staggers me." He describes the scientist's actions as a violent, penetrative act that scars what it explores. Entirely true. And in the case of IVF and surrogacy, what the discovery here, both technologically and politically, explores and scars is people, specifically innocent little babies. The case of homosexual men purchasing children through surrogacy is particularly and most obviously egregious because it involves creating babies with the express intent of denying them their mothers. The bond between babies and their mothers is the most intimate bond that human beings will ever experience. The mother is the very environment in which the baby forms. The mother's voice is the first voice the baby ever hears. Mother and child share nutrients that sustain them, both before and after birth. Many children grow up without mothers. For all of history, motherlessness has been a rare and unfortunate event in a fallen world that leaves a wound to be healed as best as it can be. Today, motherlessness is an intentional political program undertaken with the blessing of the law, which now holds that the presumed right of men to children trumps the actual right of children to their mothers. Sadly, this phenomenon, though recent, has now occurred for long enough that we can read the accounts of children who lament the trials that accompany this unnecessary hardship. The writer Katie Faust has detailed such anecdotes in The Federalist. The biological hardships, to begin, children who are conceived through surrogacy and IVF face more health problems. They tend to be born premature and underweight. Worse still, though, are the psychological and spiritual problems. Envy of their friends with mothers, the hatred of Mother's Day, the pressure not to express their anguish even, because it might make the men who raised them sad, the social adjustment issues, the difficulties bonding with the non-biological father, the identity issues, the constant wondering about half-siblings, the existence of whom they are legally barred from knowing, the increased risk of depression, the increased likelihood of being prescribed antidepressant drugs, the total neglect of their reasonable suffering by a society more concerned with stamping out imaginary phobias than with protecting the natural rights of children. The basic universal longing of children for their mothers because moms and dads are different. It's ghastly. It's absolutely horrific. It is just about the most rotten thing a society can possibly do to children. But many who have opined on this issue want to place blame just in one corner, and I, unlike them, do not. I do not even really blame the homosexuals. It's very easy to look at the situation and accuse these adult men of selfishness. And they are selfish, obviously. They put their own desires, their natural desire for children, along with their disordered desire to exclude women from that process, ahead of the rights and interests of their prospective children. But I suspect that most of them don't know that. In their defense, these men have been told by the entire culture for about 60 years now that men and women really aren't different. And if men and women really aren't different, then moms and dads really aren't different. And if moms and dads really aren't different, then why would anyone need or even want to have both of them? What's the difference between a family and a couple of fellas if that premise is true? I don't mention these harsh truths to make the men who have fallen for this lie and temptation feel bad about themselves. I don't suggest that we take away their children, though we might endeavor as best we can to introduce these children to their mothers. This is a fallen world. There is no way to undo the terrible crime that has been perpetrated on many people. The children most of all, of course, but even the men who were told that they were doing nothing wrong. The men who sincerely believed that, and who might now be listening to this speech thinking in horror, wondering, what have I done? It's a terrible feeling. We've all made mistakes, some more egregious than others, but there is no sense in trying to undo the past. There is no sense in dwelling on past sins after we've seen the error of our ways. The reason I mention all of this is to stop the crime from spreading, to prevent this from happening again in the future. I do not primarily blame the homosexual men for the growing evil of surrogacy and IVF. I don't blame the women either. We all know the statistics about children who grow up in fatherless households, the significantly higher risk of behavioral problems, of going to prison, of abuse and neglect, of drug and alcohol abuse, and so on. Kids need their fathers. It isn't complicated. At some level, every single person knows that. I do not primarily blame the homosexuals of either sex for this awful situation. They are simply following a 60-year series of delusions that our culture and politics have promoted to their logical conclusion. The primary culprit, I believe, in this case, will likely surprise my critics. The culprit is capitalism. More precisely, the culprit is capitalism unconstrained by morality. And more precisely still, the culprit is the commodification of children, of people broadly, and children in particular. Before I came here tonight, I was told that the Democratic Socialist Club of Clemson had planned a protest. There was going to be a big protest, but then it was a little chilly outside. That was enough, and they said, I don't know. Even with a coat on, it's a little too cold. So, if they were here, had they protested, they might be surprised by my thesis. Perhaps they would have given me a hero's welcome. But probably not, right? I don't think they actually would have done that. The reason they wouldn't have is that they love this kind of stuff. The left loves the commodification of people. The socialists here do not actually hate capitalism. Capitalism is a word that was popularized by Karl Marx himself, okay? Ironically, the socialists who pretend to hate capitalism actually love it, inasmuch as capitalism makes everything, including people, about money. Just as ironically, the conservatives who purport to love capitalism actually hate it, inasmuch as we know that life is about much more than money. The left might worship mammon. We do not. What we actually love, and what we call capitalism, but what we're actually talking about, is morality, which entails the protection of things like property rights, but which recognizes, crucially, that people are not property. We outlaw slavery because we recognize that people are more than property to be traded. We outlaw the sale of organs for the same reason. A true free market absolutist, the most extreme kind of capitalist, might endorse the organ trade. Reasonable people, however, recognize that it is probably wrong to harvest the organs of the poor. I think we all generally would agree on that, right? Yeah. This is the same reason we outlaw prostitution. The true free market absolutist sees no problem with prostitution. Most people, however, recognize that it is wrong to entice poor women in terrible circumstances to sell their bodies as meat. We recognize that people are more than property. Free markets can be a wonderful thing. I love the free markets, don't get me wrong. I was sucking up to the democratic socialists for a second here. They're not even in the room. Free markets can be a wonderful thing. In the words of Pope John Paul II, quote, "The free market is the most efficient instrument for utilizing resources and effectively responding to needs." But efficiency is not morality, and human beings are not mere resources to be utilized. Human beings are the subjects for whom resources are utilized. Capitalism, circumscribed by morality, is as fine a method for producing material prosperity as has ever been discovered. Capitalism, unconstrained by morality, is a monstrosity, as efficient an instrument as ever, but efficient in the degradation of people by denying their very humanity and the rights that go along with it. This ultimately is the problem with IVF and surrogacy. The chief problem with IVF and surrogacy is not that the icky gays use it, as some selectively outraged critics would seem to suggest. The chief problem with IVF and surrogacy is that it commoditizes human life. When a man begins the process of the sort of IVF and surrogacy that we've been talking about, he first opens up a catalog and he picks a woman. He would like his child to have blonde hair, so what does he do? He flips to the blonde section of the women catalog. Remember, they went after Mitt Romney for the binders full of women? That was metaphorical. Here we have literal catalogs to buy women. So they find the blonde section of women, and then the man says that he wants his kid to be smart. So he's going to need a Harvard graduate. Now, I would never choose a Harvard graduate if I wanted him. But he doesn't know. He's very confused. So he picks a Harvard graduate. And look, there might be an upcharge for that. Sure, that's okay, though. This man, he's done well in his career, and he's more than willing to pay to make sure his child never suffers the indignity of having to go to Brown or something like that. Could you imagine? Then, of course, he's got to make sure that woman has no disabilities. That's completely off the table. If he is going to shell out this kind of money, and we are talking about $100,000 easily, maybe more than that, well, he doesn't want to have to deal with any imperfections. Earlier this year, 2 homosexual men wound up suing the surrogate that they had contracted to gestate a child for them. They sued her because she had been diagnosed with cancer, and they found out that the medical treatment might cause birth defects with the child. That sounds bad enough, right? That sounds like they wanted her to forego medical treatment so that she didn't harm their baby, right? It's actually much, much worse than that. The men sued the surrogate because she refused to kill their child, or one of the men's child, through abortion. The men did not fear that the medical treatment would harm the child enough to kill him. They feared that the medical treatment would not harm the child enough to kill him. They feared that the treatment would harm the child just enough to give him a disability. And then they would have to accommodate that disability, and they didn't pay for that. They feared that their designer baby would not come out perfect, which would be inconvenient. But they also didn't want him to live because they didn't want their, quote, DNA out there. That is a direct quote. So they demanded that the surrogate kill the baby. They had paid for him, after all. They had rented the woman's womb. Whatever happened to the customer is always right. Last year, another couple of men filed a lawsuit, this time against a fertility clinic and a specialist, because these men had ordered 2 baby boys. But you know what got delivered? A baby boy and a baby girl. They didn't order that. When I order a box of cigars and I receive the wrong box, you know what I do? I send it back for a refund. I want the cigars that I want. That's what I do. If I got some other kind of cigar, I would send it back. That's how it works with all of the products that I purchase. And if people are now products, then that's how it's going to work with people too. But people are not mere products. Products don't have rights. People do, babies included. In fact, it is precisely because babies have rights that adults cannot claim to have a right to them. Many people today fall into the error of believing that they have a right to a child. Even some conservatives fall into this error. But it's preposterous. In making that claim, actually, they undermine their own argument. Because if people have any rights at all, then no one can have a right to another person. A child is not something that is owed to someone, but rather a child is a blessing, a gift that one is given. A child is the supreme gift of marriage. Not everyone receives that gift. Many married couples struggle with fertility, and it is incredibly painful. It is a terribly difficult cross to bear. But the alternative to that cross is even more terrible. And that is the treating of children as property to be bought and sold rather than as people with rights. In the matter of procreation, the only person who possesses genuine rights is the child. Those rights include the right to his mother and father and the right to be respected as a person. So far, we have only discussed the many ways in which IVF and surrogacy violate the rights of the child who is born. We have not yet even touched on the children who are not born. Because IVF is so expensive, in many cases, many human beings are created. Sometimes many embryos are implanted at once, and sometimes lots of them stick, at which point doctors advise mothers to have a reduction of the number of embryos. They will reduce, quote unquote, the embryos to a more comfortable number. That is a euphemism by which they mean the killing of some of the children in the mother's womb so that she only gives birth to one child, maybe two, instead of two children or maybe three, who knows. Even if the mother chooses not to abort any of the children that have been implanted, that usually still leaves a number of embryos, that is, of human beings, of people, sitting in a freezer. And sitting in the freezer is how they will remain if the mother doesn't want any more children. Human bodies and souls on ice until the patient or clinic decides to kill them. What about the cases in which all embryos created through IVF are implanted into the surrogate and none are aborted? In that case, we still face the problem of ripping a baby away from the surrogate, that is to say, the woman who is the nearest person to a mother that he has ever known, the voice that he has heard his whole life, short life, but his whole life, the woman who will carry his DNA in her body for the rest of her life. We use clinical language such as surrogate and gestational carrier. I'm not kidding. That is from one of the lawsuits that I just mentioned. How does that make you feel, ladies? You're a gestational carrier. It sounds like a piece of military equipment. That's the kind of dehumanizing language that plaintiffs use in these lawsuits. We use this kind of clinical language, but the bond between women and the babies they carry is permanent. We know this because scientists have discovered male DNA in the brains of women after their death, which seemed kind of strange on account of how men and women are different. But this led the scientists then to discover that the DNA was from the children that they had carried in their wombs. That is to say, that babies literally, physically, remained a part of them for the rest of their lives. But then, what about the cases in which all the embryos created through IVF are implanted, none are aborted, and no surrogate is used? This is, without question, the case that most people consider to be the most acceptable of all. And still here, we face the same fundamental problems. IVF and surrogacy, even in the most publicly acceptable case, do something that we have never seen before in American history. They establish the domination of technology over the origin and destiny of the human person. They entrust the life and identity of the babies into the power of doctors and biologists. This trust is not merited. We seem to read stories about this at least once a year now. Just last year, a California woman sued an IVF clinic for implanting the wrong embryo into her. Whoops. The woman gave birth to someone else's child. One supposes that another woman gave birth to her child. Now whose child is whose? This was not a one-off incident. Earlier this year, a North Texas couple sued a Fort Worth fertility clinic for using the wrong sperm to conceive their children through in vitro fertilization. Bigger oops, huh? In the case of the California couple, perhaps they could trade the baby back to his rightful parents, whoever they might be. Strange as it is to say, one might think of a solution in that bizarre case. In the case of the Texas couple, what is anybody supposed to do? The doctors just created a baby whose parents are not married, whose parents did not intend to create a baby together, whose parents are married to other people. What are those adults supposed to do? More importantly, more horrifyingly, what is that poor baby supposed to do? It's ghastly. No one who gives this matter sufficient thought can seriously defend this dehumanizing process. And yet, there is one final argument in favor of IVF and surrogacy, and it is the most persuasive argument of all precisely because it is not an argument. The argument is that there are many people today who owe their lives to IVF and surrogacy. Some of my friends were conceived this way. Many people owe the existence of their own children to IVF and surrogacy. A number of my friends and many of my acquaintances have done it. And what those parents instinctively say to any criticism of IVF and surrogacy, any look that's a little bit too close into the details, is they will say, without IVF and surrogacy, my kids wouldn't exist. So damn your arguments, damn your bioethics, I don't care where your reasoning leads you, I support IVF. That's what they say, and it's completely understandable. That is a totally natural reaction. Because kids are good. Kids conceived through IVF are just as good and have just as much a right to life as kids conceived the old-fashioned way. Of course. But good ends do not justify evil means. No end, no matter how good, justifies immoral means. A child conceived in rape is just as good as children conceived in marital love. Of course. He has just as much a right to life as a child conceived in any other way. But his goodness and his right to life do not, therefore, justify rape. We still discourage rape. We outlaw rape. Without rape, that child would not exist. And the child is a blessing. But rape is obviously wrong, so we outlaw it. There is no contradiction in that sentence. A friend of mine is fond of observing that facts do not care about one's feelings. You may know this friend. Now, I have pointed out to this friend of mine that while facts might not care about feelings, politics almost exclusively cares about feelings. And we are feeling creatures. That's part of what makes us human. But our feelings can deceive us. I am not the first to observe that the imagination of man's heart is prone to evil from his youth. Even the best of intentions, detached from the rigors of logic and the constraints of morality, can go terribly wrong. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. Modern technology can dazzle us. Ideological fads can hypnotize us. But eternal truths remain, whether we wish to acknowledge them or not. People have rights, which means that people are not property, which means that kids are not commodities.